live in a cold climate, chances are that at some point in your life you've either experienced or seen houses with ice dams. Hi, I'm Chris Novelli from N3 Architecture. I'm here to provide some tips for homeowners so that they can better understand design and construction and make better decisions on their projects. So today we're talking about ice dams. So if you followed me on other channels, you know that I have a podcast called the Home Design Academy where I go through a lot of these things, teaching homeowners about design and construction. So I did a pretty extensive episode on that podcast about ice dams. And so if you are interested in this topic, go and check that out. There's also some resources on my website about ice dams and how to prevent them, and you can find that at n3architecture.com/resources. So if you're in a cold climate and you have had ice dams on your house before, chances are it's caused by one of two things. First is inadequate venting of your attic. That's assuming that you have a cold attic and not a warm attic. We can get into that. And number two, penetrations through your ceiling into your attic level. And that's pipes, light fixtures, ductwork, wires, etc. So the way ice dams are formed is when it snows, that snow sits on top of your roof and it's cold and your attic is cold and it doesn't melt, right? That's good. That's what you want. You don't want that snow to melt. But what happens when your house isn't built the right way is the warm air from the heated space goes up through your ceiling, through the penetrations around light fixtures and ductwork and wires and piping, etc. And it warms the underside of the plywood sheathing on your roof, essentially melting that bottom layer of snow that's packed up there. And that bottom layer of snow, once it melts, that water drops down your roof, and then when it gets to the overhang, when there's no more warm air underneath it, it gets to the overhang and it starts to refreeze. And as it refreezes, it creates a point in which new water that's dripping down can't pass by. And so that water continues to drip down, it hits the frozen part, and it freezes and starts backing up, and it starts backing up further and further and further, and it will essentially work its way underneath your roof shingles and then find your way into the house and start leaking. And that's what we don't want, right? That's the worst case scenario. So one of the best ways to avoid ice dams is to have a fully vented roof. And the best method is a soffit to ridge venting system. And that is a continuous vent along your soffit, which is the overhangs at the bottom edge of the roof. Continuous vent on that side that allows the cold air to come up and run alongside the bottom edge of that plywood sheathing on the inside of your house, keeping it nice and cold, and then venting out the top through the ridge. That is the best venting system. Again, that's for cold attics. If you have a warm attic, like if you have a Cape Cod style house, or if your upper level attic is a finished space, then you want to be concentrating on air sealing between the conditioned space and the unconditioned space outside and making sure that no warm air can escape through there. The next tip that I like to talk about when avoiding ice dams is to have no penetrations through your ceiling on the upper level of your house and the attic. And if you're a ranch house, that means it's your main floor. Between that main floor and the attic, if you have a colonial style house or a Cape Cod style house, it's between the second floor or the third floor, however many floors there are, and the attic space. It doesn't really matter if it's the first floor or second floor. It's just between the conditioned space and the unconditioned space if you have a cold attic. So you want to minimize all penetrations. And sorry to all the people out there who love recessed can light fixtures, but you do not want to ever use a recessed light fixture in that space between the warm conditioned space and your cold attic. And sure, you can talk to people who might say that as long as you air seal around those recessed can light fixtures, that stops the penetration of warm air to cold air, but it doesn't really stop it 100%. So I just like to avoid having any recessed can light fixtures in that upper plane. The next is ductwork. I don't ever recommend any ductwork be run in the attic and then down into the space. That's bad during the winter time. That's bad during the summertime. So it doesn't matter if you're heating or cooling. I would try to really find a different way, find a different solution than running ductwork up in your attic. That's a lazy solution in my opinion. Now, of course, you are going to have exhaust ductwork and plumbing vents that go through that space. And so that's unavoidable. So you just have to really focus to make sure that those penetrations are sealed up properly and no warm air can escape up into the attic. My next tip for avoiding ice dams is to have roofs with simple shapes. The more complicated a roof, the more intersections you have, the more levels you have, the harder it is to get a proper air sealing, the harder it is to get proper ventilation. So a nice simple roof structure will make it so much easier to build and to make sure that you have the proper ventilation. My next tip for avoiding ice dams is to properly air seal all of the penetrations and joints. And we already went through that a little bit when I talked about the penetrations through your ceiling, but it's also important to concentrate on sealing up any joints between different materials. So this could be between your ceiling level on your upper floor and the attic floor framing. That's a joint where air could potentially get up. So if you seal around those intersections, it's going to create a much tighter house and it's going to prevent that warm air from going up through the attic. The next thing to talk about is insulation baffles. Now, insulation baffles, when you have a vented roof and a vented attic, insulation baffles they go at the eaves and they tuck in between the roof rafters, and it allows the space between the soffit vent and the rafters and the sheathing, that void space, it allows it to maintain that air clearance so that the cold air can move in and up. What you don't want is you don't want insulation, whether it's fiberglass insulation or spray foam or cellulose. You don't want the insulation to get into that space where the cold air is flowing, because you need to maintain that continuous soffit to ridge venting system. And if that insulation blocks it, then you won't have the proper ventilation to keep the underside of your sheathing cold, and the snow's going to eventually melt. So there's many types of insulation baffles. The absolute worst kind are the foam inserts that you just slide in there and put into place. They also make cardboard ones that you can secure. Those are a little bit better, but my favorite, and it costs a little bit more, but it's worth it in the end, is to have solid insulation baffles built out of plywood. Because another thing you have to worry about is wind washing, and that is if there's a storm where there's high winds, you can actually have the winds come through the soffit vent, and especially if you have cellulose insulation that blows around easily, that wind could potentially blow the insulation away from the edge of your wall, and then you have a spot of your ceiling that's not insulated because it's blown out. But if you have a solid baffle in there that's made out of plywood or something similar that's screwed to the underside of the rafters, or maybe screwed to a little ledger on the side of the rafters, then you know that you won't get that wind washing effect, because the baffle is solid and it's secured, rather than something that's loose like the foam ones that's loose and can be blown away. The next thing that you want to do is you want to provide an ice and water shield on the bottom edge of your roof. And these are a rubber membrane. They come in 3-foot wide rolls, and it's self-adhered, and you stick it down to the top of the roof sheathing. And I like to go a minimum of 6 feet up from the edge. And that ice and water shield, that's just an insurance policy. If you've air sealed properly, vented properly, and make sure you have no penetrations, then chances are you won't ever get ice dams. But if you do potentially get an ice dam, that ice and water shield will make sure that any water or any ice that works its way underneath your shingles and melts will have a path to drain out instead of draining down into your house. And then the final tip for today, and this is more for existing houses, if you've had problems with ice dams in the past, or if you have a complicated roof form, then you might want to consider adding in some mechanical ventilation. And this is a fan that gets installed at the roof level. I'm not talking about whole house fans that get installed within the ceiling. Those are just awful and no one should ever use them. But if you have a complicated roof or a hip roof structure, which that's another topic, I highly avoid hip roofs in the Northeast or in cold climates, because you have a less ventilation area at the ridge. You have plenty of soffit ventilation, but it doesn't always make it up to the ridge. Story for another day. But with the mechanical ventilation, it gets installed at the roof level, and it will suck that warm air out of the attic and then exhaust it out to the outside, thus cooling your space. So there you go. There's a little bit about ice dams and how you can avoid them. Thank you very much for watching.